Hello and welcome to this GCSE Pearson 2.0 English Language Paper 2 walkthrough. My name is Lisa and there are a series of other videos that are for GCSE Pearson 2.0 in my channel, YouTube channel, Lisa's Lessons. So please do have a little look at those. There are some that are specific to particular skills on paper 2, and there are also a series of videos that are relevant to paper 1 as well. So this walkthrough is going to be concentrating on Lord of the Rings paper. So that's the paper with the extract for Lord of the Rings and Alive on it. And that paper was sat on June 2024. So as we have a little look at this paper, we'll remind ourselves of how paper 2 is looking at contemporary text. So if you've just sat paper 1 and you're about to sit paper 2, you can forget the Victorian text now because your texts are of this period. So they're usually of the late 20th, early 21st century. This exam paper has a total of 80 marks split into 2 parts, as does paper 1. Section A is again responding to 2 texts, as does paper 1, but this time you're given to read contemporary fiction and literary non-fiction. So that includes things like biographies and memoir extracts, as alongside extracts of novels and short stories. Section B is your writing task, which is creative. So we'll talk through this example of paper 2 together. You might like to highlight or underline words or phrases or make notes as we work. You can access the paper through the Pearson website, so you can download yourself a copy to do that if you wish. You might like to attempt the paper after the session. Maybe you could send it to your tutor to mark to get a little bit of feedback prior to the exam for 2026, which is on the 5th of June. Okay, so in terms of managing your time, here is a breakdown of the questions that you have on paper 2. So questions 1 to 6 have been allocated the amount of marks that you get for each question. And you will see here that they're relatively equally weighted compared to paper 1, except of course for question 6 and then 7 or 8. You have 2 questions where you have to pick out a piece of information very quickly and they're worth 1 mark. So that's your question 1 and your question 3. You've got 2 language analysis questions on this paper, and one of them was also analysing structure as well as language. You've got a synthesis of information question 5, where you look at similarities. And you've also got another comparison question where you can look at similarities and or differences on a particular focus. And obviously each of those questions we'll look through in turn in a moment and have a look at what we need to do to achieve the marks on those. And I'll give you some advice and guidance on how to achieve these. So my guidance for you today is both as a current lecturer of this paper, of this exam board, and also as an examiner. Obviously, question 7 or 8, you've got a choice between 2 questions here, different to other exam boards. Is your imaginative writing task, your creative writing task, your task where you have to write to entertain and use your imagination to achieve. So I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So in terms of the paper and the breakdown of the paper, you've got questions 1 to 6 on section A, which are testing your reading and your comprehension. You've got 40 marks for that, and I would recommend you spend about 1 hour and 10 on that part of the paper. I would also recommend that you do those questions in order. The reason why I suggest you do those questions in order is because there's a bit of a natural build up there. Question 1, you're dipping into text 1, and then question 2, you're analysing text 1 once you've become familiar with it, and then you do the same again for questions 3 and 4. Question 5, you're bringing together the information from both texts, and question 6, a more in-depth comparison. So if you do them out of sync, the likelihood is you're almost like working doubly hard when you don't really need to. If you do them in order, that natural progression will allow you to grow your engagement and your understanding of the text. Section B is your creative writing task. As I mentioned, you've got a choice between questions 7 or 8, and your total marks are 40 on that, and therefore I recommend you spend about 45 minutes on that question. You should spend 5 to 10 minutes of that 45 minutes on planning. That is important. I will talk more about that later. And about 5 minutes of proofreading, also equally important. You have a decision to make, though, that you could, if you wished, do section B before you do section A. So if your strength is writing and you prefer to do the creative writing first, then you absolutely can do that. Though I would suggest that you're very, very strict with yourself in terms of time. And after 45 minutes, you really do need to stop and go on to section A. You don't want to run out of time and not get round to question 6, for example, as that's worth so many marks. In terms of the breakdown of the paper and what the paper looks like, you have the first 2 questions to do with text 1, the second 2 questions to do with text 2, and then the final 2 questions are your comparison questions. So a suggestion for you here is that you might like to read text 1 and do questions 1 and 2 whilst you've just got text 1 to think about, rather than bombarding your brain with text 2 when you don't quite need it yet. So once you've done the 2 questions for text 1, read text 2 and do the questions on text 2. As you're reading text 2 for the first time, you know that later on you're going to have comparison questions. So if they start jumping out to you as you're reading text 2, so you're noticing, for example, similarities between that and text 1, start to highlight them as you go, because that could be a bit of a time saver later on. You know you're going to do that later. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to read through the text 1, and we're going to attempt looking at the first 2 questions. So using the method that I suggested a moment ago. So in this edited extract from a fantasy novel, the hobbit Sam helps carry his friend Frodo up Mount Doom. They had reached the mountain's foot on its northern side and a little to the westward. There, its long grey slopes, through broken, were not sheer. Frodo did not speak, and so Sam struggled on as best he could, having no guidance but the will to climb as high as he might before his strength gave out and his will broke. On he toiled, up and up, turning this way and that to lessen the slope, often stumbling forward and at the last crawling like a snail with a heavy burden on its back. When his will could drive him no further and his limbs gave way, he stopped and laid Frodo gently down. Frodo opened his eyes and drew a breath. "Thank you, Sam," he said in a cracked whisper. "How far is there to go?" "I don't know," said Sam, "because I don't know where we're going." He looked back and then he looked up, and he was amazed to see how far his last effort had brought him. The mountain, standing ominous and alone, had looked taller than it was. The confused and tumbled shoulders of its great base rose from maybe 3,000 feet above the plain, and above them was reared half as high again, its tall central cone like a vast chimney cap with a jagged crater. As he looked up, he would have given a shout, for amid the rugged humps above him, he saw plainly a path or road. It climbed from the west and wound snake-like about the mountain until it reached the foot of the cone upon its eastern side. A gleam of hope returned to him. They might conquer the mountain yet. Why, it might have been put there on purpose, he said to himself. Sam drew a deep breath. There was a path, but how he was to get up to the slope to it, he did not know. Suddenly a sense of urgency, which he did not understand, came to Sam. It was almost as if he'd been called. Now, or it'll be too late. He braced himself and got up. Frodo also seemed to have felt the call. He struggled to his knees. "I'll crawl, Sam," he gasped. So foot by foot, like small grey insects, they crept up the slope. They came to the path and found that it was broad, paved with broken rubble and beaten ash. After climbing eastward for some time, it bent back upon itself at a sharp angle and went westward. There, at the bend, it was cut deep through a crag of old weathered stone, once long ago vomited from the mountain's surface. Vernices, sorry, not surface. Okay, so the first question then has been lifted from the exam paper here. And the question 1 is, from lines 1 to 8, identify one word or phrase that shows that Sam and Frodo are finding the journey difficult. So the total mark for this question is just 1. So really you should only spend a couple of minutes on this question. It shouldn't take too long to find this information. You've got a short extract that you can pull it from. We'll look at that in a moment. But firstly, I just want to point out my advice in terms of this. Firstly, I always recommend to my students that you highlight the line numbers that you need to focus on this question. That prevents you from answering the question about the wrong section. And I would also go to the text itself and highlight there as well the lines that you are indeed needing to refer to. If you were to answer the question about the wrong section, you won't get a mark and you've just wasted a few minutes. So we don't want to do either of those things. We want to make sure we've got it from the right section. So highlight that in your question, get into that habit if you can. The second thing that I would do is also highlight the focus of the question. So in this case, we've got to highlight that it's information that tells us that Sam and Frodo are finding the journey difficult. We don't want to pull out anything that doesn't tell us that or highlight the difficult journey. So we do want to make sure we have a focus. So highlight that in the question too. So use only lines then from 1 to 8 for your quotes and examples. And this question is asking you to find explicit information, so something that's clearly stated and direct. So you should be able to pick out the quote. You are permitted, however, to paraphrase and put it in your own words if you prefer. Okay, and I've done that for you here on this question. So this is the section from they had reached the mountains right down to Frodo gently down. What I've done here is I've highlighted for you any of the elements that could help to answer the question about how difficult Sam and Frodo found the journey. Now, this is my recommendation for you so that you can then pick the one that you feel that best answers the question. So long grey slopes, of course, implies that it's difficult. You might need a little bit of an explanation to go with that, but of course that uses up time. So something like Sam struggled on as best he could actually emphasises it was difficult, because difficult and struggled are very similar words. They mean the same thing, they're synonyms. So you definitely could pick that one out without needing to put any kind of explanation. It would be a nice quick one for you. But anything else here that's highlighted, such as the idea of stumbling or crawling or heavy burden on his back, all of those indicates a difficult journey, but they may need a little bit of an explanation, which of course takes time. Okay, so if you choose words like stumbling, crawling his limbs, you might need to clarify what you're talking about and how it helps you to answer the question. Okay, now our next question is the first of our language analysis questions. Now, although we're not actually going to use the timer here, this is a PowerPoint that I would use to deliver this element, this concept to my students. So the timer is there for a reason. And that reason is that you might want to give yourself 10 minutes to do this question. Bearing in mind it's 6 marks, I always recommend you round up to the nearest 5 to give you a bit of an indication about how long to spend on a question. So after I've gone through this question, you might want to pause the video here and you might want to attempt to answer this question using the exam paper, which, as I said, you can download from the Pearson website. Time yourself for 10 minutes and see how far you get. So that's really good at building up stamina and making sure that you've got enough time to do the questions. Because when it comes to stamina and timing, really practice is the best way to improve on that. So this question says then, in the extract, how does the writer use language to show that Mount Doom is an unwelcoming place? Use examples from the extract and relevant subject terminology. As I mentioned, you get 6 marks from that. So the idea down the bottom here is to try and give 3 separate examples. This isn't written on the question itself. This is my advice to you. And the reason why I would suggest you try and find 3 separate examples is if you were to refer to the mark scheme, you'll notice that to get 5 or 6 marks, so the top band, you need to be able to give a range of subject terminology. So if you're just talking about one technique that the writers use, that definitely isn't a range. I mean, I'd even challenge you to say that 2 is a range. I'd say that was a couple. So if you're working on 3 different techniques that the writer uses, 3 different pieces of language that the writer uses to tell us that Mount Doom is an unwelcoming place, then I would say that you are using a range, which could potentially give you access to that top mark band, although there are a few other things you need to do to get there as well, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. So in terms of this question, a temptation often is with students who are, skating around the sort of grade 3 mark to start writing about the techniques that they've found, but not actually focus on the question. So therefore, I'd like you to get into the habit of highlighting what the question is asking you to look at. And in this case, that Mount Doom is an unwelcoming place. So I would always highlight that in the question. It does have a focus, and the subject, the language that you're pulling out needs to actually answer that question. Does it describe how Mount Doom is an unwelcoming place? Do not be tempted to feature spot. Don't be tempted to read through the extract and go, oh, the writers used a simile, the writers used a metaphor, and the writers used personification, and then explain what it means, because that's not going to hit the mark. We want 3 pieces of language, 3 examples of language that actually show us that Mount Doom is an unwelcoming place. And then we need to peel that back and look at what techniques the writer has used to tell us that. So only refer to the given extract, focus on what words or phrases stand out from the whole extract. Do they make you feel a certain way about or imagine something? And your example should be about Mount Doom. If they're not, then it's not relevant to the question. So here is the extract. I'm going to read this through, and as I'm doing this, hopefully some words and phrases are popping out to you as being about how unwelcoming Mount Doom is to you. He looked back and then he looked up, and he was amazed to see how far his last effort had brought him. The mountain, standing ominous and alone, had looked taller than it was. The confused and tumbled shoulders of its great base raised for maybe 3,000 feet above the plain, and above them was reared half as high again its tall central cone, like a vast chimney capped with a jagged crater. As he looked up, he would have given a shout, for amid the rugged humps above him, he saw plainly a path or road. It climbed from the west and wound snake-like about the mountain until it reached the foot of the cone upon its eastern side. Okay, so what I've done here is I've underlined all the words and phrases that I feel helps us to understand that Mount Doom is an ominous and unwelcoming place. So I've used the word ominous because it's actually jumping out at me here because it's bold. Okay, so the mountain, standing ominous and alone, looked taller than it was, which of course implies the idea that it was overwhelming perhaps. Confused and tumbled shoulders. I really love that description of the crater, and then pulling down towards the top mid part of the mountain, and how the rubble is sort of gathering around the area, making it look like shoulders. Rose for maybe 3,000 feet above, so getting that idea of it being very high and overwhelming. Was reared half as high again at its tall central cone. A nice simile here, like the vast chimney cap with a jagged crater. Some lovely adjectives: vast and jagged. Rugged humps. Again, rugged implies it's quite difficult to walk on, I would say. And it climbed from the west and wound snake-like. So a nice alliteration there. And of course, our simile, snake-like. So what we're doing here is we're pulling out the words and phrases that tell us it's unwelcoming, and then working backwards, we're then going to try and find out which three we like the most, and then which three we feel that we could talk about confidently and name the technique that the writer has used. And when it comes to language analysis on this paper, we can absolutely talk about our beautiful figurative language, which I've just given you some examples of, such as similes, personification, metaphor, but actually we can also talk about our word classes, and it's really worth your while making sure that you're up on your word classes to talk about the interesting use of the adjectives such as rugged and jagged. It's a really great idea. So be up on your adjectives, be up on your adverbs, be up on your nouns, be up on your verbs. Know what those different word classes mean so that you can definitely identify lots of interesting language use, even if you can't see or are confident talking about your figurative language. It's just as good. You can also talk about patterns. Whilst you don't talk about structure in this question, some techniques, language techniques, double up both the structure and language, and you can definitely use those. So I'm talking about things like semantic field, repetition, rule of three. They're things that you could talk about as well. And in this way, some of the language analysis that you're doing on this paper is different to what you did on paper one. Paper one is much more about language to persuade. Here we're using language to entertain us and to transport us to an imaginative world, and it's those techniques that the examiner is wanting you to be able to pull out here and talk about how it actually does do that, how it does transport you to the imaginative world, maybe how it's sensory, for example, and makes you feel a certain way. So when you're doing a question like this, what you want to be doing is using a version of PEE paragraphs. So when we're talking about PEE paragraphs, of course, different schools, different colleges, different institutions will potentially use quite different acronyms to remember the different components of this paragraph. But in essence, they're all the same. So what you want to do is you want to state your point. How has the writer used the language to create a feeling of an unwelcoming place? Maybe they made you feel it's an unwelcoming place because it's actually very difficult to climb, or maybe it's very overwhelming in terms of its size, or maybe it's got a personality. And then in terms of your evidence, you want to have quotes to back that up. And then you need to be explaining how that language has worked, how it's painted a picture in your mind for a particular concept or a particular idea. Don't waste time with an introduction or a conclusion. Don't waste time by starting off with, the writer uses lots of really interesting language techniques. We don't need that. But do make sure you support everything you say with evidence in terms of quotes. Always think about the effect on the reader and who those readers might be. In this case, it's usually you. Think about the why and the how a certain language feature has been used. It will stop you then talking about what feature has been used. I don't want you to just tell us the writers used a simile. I want you to tell me how the writers used a simile and why they've used that particular simile. What does that do for you? What does it paint a picture of for you? Clear points about the effect of the language is really important, not just listing lots of different language techniques. Make sure your evidence is there. Keep your quotations short and to the point. So you might want to embed your quotes, or you might want to have the beginning and the end of a quote with a bit of ellipsis in the middle if you don't need the entire thing. I've stuck a T on the end here, just to remind you that although I talk about PEE paragraphs, PEAT paragraphs are probably more effective to think about at this stage. So the T standing for the technique. Whilst I've talked a lot about how important it is to analyze the language and talk about why the writers use that particular idea, do name the technique as well to get those maximum marks. It's not the most important thing, but it's got to be there. Points which are focused on the question are really important. So in this case, how Mount Doom is unwelcoming. General points about the language are not rewarded on this question unless they are linked to the question. So they need to be relevant to the question. You can't just, talk about Frodo or Sam. It's got to be about how the mountain is unwelcoming to them. So possible things you could talk about in answer to this question, and I have mentioned a few as I've gone through, is the use of personification. For example, the mountain is described as standing alone. It emphasizes dramatic presence of the place the travellers must now climb. Obviously, you can go into detail with that, and I would encourage you to do so. The further personification of the confused and tumbled shoulders. The mountain suggests an unnatural, broken landscape the travellers must deal with, and that's going to be difficult to climb. The use of descriptive adjectives. Ominous, for example, describes a dangerous and threatening mountain. So talk about, what the word ominous means, what you understand by that. And then one of my favorites here, the simile snake-like to describe the possible path up the mountain further heightens the sense of danger and threat in the area. So I'd recommend you work for 3 paragraphs looking for 3 different techniques, such as a paragraph about the personification of standing alone, paragraph about the adjective ominous, paragraph about the simile snake-like. In order to be able to achieve that range, always have in the back of your mind that you want to try and talk about 3 different techniques to really help you to achieve that. Range plus analysis could achieve 6 marks if you've got all your components present. So do have a little look at how you analyze. And in addition to that, there are loads and loads of videos out there about how to analyze language, but I just want to kind of put my little take on it. You don't have to analyze every single paragraph. You have to move towards analysis to be getting into that top band. So every single thing you say doesn't need to be analyzed. Definitely, though, try and choose at least one component that you can analyze. So if I had a paragraph, for example, about the use of the simile snake-like, obviously I can talk about how that emphasizes the idea of the winding of the snake around the mountain, okay? And that's definitely an explanation that could get you into the middle of that band if you explain, what physically what that path might look like around the mountain. Of course, moving towards the exploration element, you would talk about how snakes might imply danger and threat. Normally, we're a bit scared of snakes. Snakes aren't the friendliest of creatures, perhaps. So you could talk about how maybe you want to tread on a snake. So is it really safe to talk about, standing on the path if it's snake-like? But moving forward in terms of a little bit more analysis, we could definitely explore the idea of why a snake has been used rather than, say, a worm, another windy, wiggly creature, because a snake is often used in literature as implying threat and danger. And we can think about, for example, the use of the Bible, where the snake or serpent perhaps is used to represent the evil elements such as the devil. So definitely we could talk about how there's perhaps some kind of unknown evil associated with this mountain, which those of you who are familiar, of course, with Lord of the Rings might recognize to be true. So in terms of analysis, we're delving into that particular word or phrase and thinking, well, why has the writer chosen that word and not something similar to that? Explaining that and exploring that definitely moves towards analysis, the connotations of that word, the meaning of that word or phrase. So in order to achieve the higher marks, that's what we want to be moving towards. And here is the mark scheme to help us to understand how that would work. So in this case, we have got 3 levels on this question. And as I mentioned earlier on, to get in the middle level, which is about your grade 4, you're looking at an explanation of the text and how language is used. So explain why the writers use the word snake. Selection of references is generally appropriate. So you want really 2 or 3 different references to the use of language and some relevant terminology. So you might, for example, have maybe only given me a couple of techniques, or you might have done 2 adjectives and 1 personification, for example, or maybe you've got your similes and your metaphors mixed up, might allow you to get into that box. But then moving towards the higher levels, you want to be analysing, so as my example earlier on about the snake-like concept, and you want a precise use of a range of subject terminology. So you want to know your stuff when it comes to your language techniques, including, of course, your word classes, and you want to be using a range of different techniques as well. So that's why I'm suggesting you use 3. Okay, so just a little bit of a reminder here then, explanation versus analysis. So what does the writer mean in terms of explain? What does it mean to the reader? But when it comes to analysis, layers of one of the same word or phrase. What other connotations can we find? How else can we interpret it? Why has the writer chosen that particular word or phrase? What does that suggest? Okay, so we're now going to move on to our second text in order to look at our next 2 questions. So this time we've got an edited extract from the writer's account of his survival after a plane crash in the Andes mountain of South America. So after months of waiting to be rescued, the writer and some of his friends decide to try to climb to safety, leaving the other survivors at camp. So you might notice that this is a piece of literary non-fiction. So this is an extract from a memoir or a diary entry or autobiography of somebody who was involved in the plane crash, which the movie Alive was based on, which is actually available to view on some streaming platforms. We waved one last time and then began to climb. We did not know that the altimeter was wrong. The crash site wasn't at 7,000 feet as we thought, but close to 12,000. Nor did we know that the mountain we were about to challenge was one of the highest in the Andes, soaring to the height of nearly 17,000 feet with slopes so steep and difficult they would test a team of expert climbers. The 3 of us were climbing in street clothes with only the crude tools we could fashion out of materials salvaged from the plane. Our bodies were ravaged from months of exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. If we had known anything about climbing, we would have seen we were already doomed. Luckily, we knew nothing. Our ignorance provided our only chance. The incline of the mountain grew steadily sharper, and soon we reached slopes that were too steep and windblown to hold deep drifts of snow. The mountain fell away so steeply behind me now that when I looked down on Tintin and Roberto, I saw only their heads and shoulders outlined against the empty sky. Turning to look behind me was like pirouetting on the ledge of a skyscraper. "Do you still think we can make it by nightfall?" asked Roberto. He was looking at the summit. I shrugged. "We should look for a place to set up camp." Huddled together in the sleeping bag, we kept ourselves from freezing, but still we suffered terribly. In the morning, we placed our frozen shoes in the sun and rested the bag until they thawed. Then after eating and packing our things, we began to climb. How we continued to climb, I cannot say. I was shivering uncontrollably from cold and fatigue. My body was on the verge of complete collapse. Roberto was sullen that night as we lay in the sleeping bag. "We will die if we keep climbing," he said. "The mountain is too high." "What can we do but climb?" I asked. It was an agonizing process inching up the mountain, and the hours passed slowly. Sometime in late morning, I spotted blue sky above a ridgeline and worked my way towards it. After so many false summits, I had learned to keep my hopes in check, but this time as I climbed over the ridge's edge, the slope fell away flat and I found myself standing on a gloomy hump of rock and wind-scoured snow. It dawned on me slowly that there was no more mountain above me. I had reached the top. Okay, so question 3 then is another 1-mark question. This one, again, should be very quick to dip into, although this one is a little bit different to the first question in terms of the fact that, we are now looking for something which is implicit. So basically suggested or hinted at, not necessarily directly stated. So you want to work a little bit harder for this one. It's inferred information rather than spat out for you. So from this extract, identify one thing the writer mentions that suggests that the group were unprepared for their climb. So 1 mark question, and this time we're given the extract. Here is the extract. We did not know that the altimeter was wrong. The crash site wasn't at 7,000 feet as we thought, but close to 12,000. Nor did we know that the mountain we were about to challenge was one of the highest in the Andes, soaring to the height of nearly 17,000 feet with slopes so steep and difficult they would test a team of expert climbers. The 3 of us were climbing in street clothes with only the crude tools we could fashion out of materials salvaged from the plane. Our bodies were ravaged from months of exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. If we had known anything about climbing, we'd have seen they were already doomed. Luckily, we knew nothing. Our ignorance provided our only chance. So some of the possible options we could have picked out here were things like we did not know that the altimeter was wrong. The group had misjudged the height of the crash site. They didn't know the mountain was one of the highest. They were climbing in street clothes with crude tools. The group is ravaged from months of exhaustion and they knew nothing about climbing or were ignorant. So note that either your quote or paraphrase explanation has to be linked back to the question here. And note that we have got a combination of either quotes or paraphrase. Either is fine. Okay, now we're going to move on to question 4. Question 4 is our one and only nod to structure on this paper and indeed across the whole of the 2 papers on Pearson 2.0. And this question says the writer describes a group of survivors climbing to freedom. That's the only part that's different on this question, season to season. The rest of it from this point onwards is exactly the same and will be exactly the same for those of you who are sitting in 2026 for your June the 5th paper. How does the writer try to interest and engage the reader? So notice that's actually quite loose, it's quite open. You can choose anything really that's interested you and engaged you as a reader as you're reading through this text. And it is about the entire text. You don't have an extract here that you need to focus on. So a little bit of work there to do this. And because of that, we're rewarded with a few more marks, which you can allow yourself up to 15 minutes to spend. Again, as I said with the previous question, I've popped a timer on here just to remind you that you could definitely pause this video and have a look at the paper and attempt this question in 15 minutes, and then I'll go through the answers in a moment. So if you wanted to pause that here, you could do that. So in terms of this question, what do we need to do? Well, we need to make sure that we talk about both language and structure on this question. We also need to talk about the effect on the reader. But to be honest, if you're using PEE paragraphs, so point, evidence, explain, the explain element is going to talk about the effect on the reader. You would always do that anyway. So I would almost, not address that as a separate bullet point, but combine that into your comments on your language or your comments on your structure. That is just a reminder to make sure that you actually do that. And again, in a little yellow box down the corner here, I've put PEE and in brackets T to remind you to make sure that you tell us the technique, use the terminology that's actually going to help you to hit the maximum marks. And again, my advice is that you work on 3, although you could do 4 paragraphs here. What is really important is that you do talk about both language and structure, although it doesn't have to be equally balanced. So you could, for example, do 2 paragraphs about language and 1 paragraph about structure. Or if you prefer to do the other way around, you could, or you could do 2 language and 2 structure if you wanted to. It really does depend on what you find, what you're more confident talking about. And when we're talking about language, well, we've already talked at length about language on question 2 in terms of what sorts of things we could talk about. But this is just a reminder, focus on what words and phrases stand out to you from the whole text. How do they make you feel? What do they make you think about? What do they make you imagine? Name the technique and talk about how it works. Don't just feature spot, exactly the same as advice as question 2, but instead think about what stands out to you as being exciting, engaging, interesting, and then tell us what technique has been used to do that. In terms of structure, this is a little bit like Marmite to some learners in terms of your, your confidence level with it. Some students really like talking about structure. Some students find it quite challenging. Now, those of you who've done a different exam board, you might find it easier to do 3 paragraphs, each one focusing on a different part of the extract. So you could have a paragraph where you look at the beginning of the extract, talking about what happens in the beginning, the focus in the beginning, and also picking out a language technique within that. You could then do the same for the middle, and then you could do the same for the end. That is not necessarily what I'm advising here, though. It's just something that's a bit of a comfort blanket to some students who come from a different exam board and then sit this exam board in college. What is probably preferred, though, by this exam board, I would like to suggest, is that you might talk about language techniques in 2 paragraphs and then structure in another paragraph, or vice versa. So things that you can talk about in terms of structure, you can definitely talk about the sentence length and the use of punctuation, the paragraph length in terms of maybe that single sentence paragraph at the end that kind of highlights that, that reaching of culmination of the climax of the story. But you could also focus on things that perhaps hit both language and structure, such as patterns, listing, repetition, rule of 3, semantic field. My advice to my students, though, is always to consider talking about narrative voice. No matter what this extract throws at you and what techniques there are, you can always talk about the narrative voice. And quite often, because this extract is literary non-fiction, in terms of narrative voice, you could explore the idea of things like the fact that it could be first person, and what first person lends to you. So first person narrative voice, of course, is always very much featuring emotional responses, sensory responses. We see the ideas through the eyes of the person telling the story. So I would suggest that one of your paragraphs is talking about that, because of course that is a structural technique. Also talk about, when it talks about the effect on the reader, weaving into your language or your structure paragraphs, why you think the writers picked those particular words, phrases, techniques, sentence types, and what they intended to make you feel or imagine and understand. So you've got a few choices there about, what feels comfortable to you. It depends what grade you're aiming at. Obviously the higher levels are going to be able to talk about the use of punctuation and sentence structure for effect. But those of you who are just wanting to pass, talking about narrative voice is definitely going to be enough for you here, with a couple of language techniques such as, the use of a simile, use of a metaphor, use of interesting adjectives. Okay, so let's have a look at the mark scheme and how this works. Now, please note the really important element of this is the fact that you are not going to be able to achieve above 4 marks if you only consider language or structure. So if you just do a little bit of analysis of language or a little bit of analysis of structure and not both, 4 marks is your cap here. It doesn't matter how good your analysis is. If you've done it well, but you've only talked about one or the other concept or idea, you're not going to get above 4 marks. So please bear that in mind. In terms of the mark scheme, other than that, it's actually quite similar to question 2, that to get the middle band, you're going to be explaining how language, and in this case, of course, structure as well, is used to interest and engage readers. And you're going to have some use of relevant subject terminology. So as I mentioned earlier on, maybe you've got a technique, or maybe you've doubled up on your techniques, or maybe you've got your technique a little bit wrong, but you still could get into that box if those components are there and you've really explained why you think the writer has used those techniques. We've got a middle layer here where we explore, so we're really starting to look at why the writer might have used that particular technique. But then, as mentioned earlier on question 2, in terms of analysis, the analysis component is here for the higher marks, and you've got again this concept of a range of subject terminology as well, in order to achieve those top marks. But definitely doable. If you've got your analysis, you've got a range of different techniques, including both language and structure, you're definitely going to be able to access those higher marks on this question. But if you want to just, pass the grade 4, then you're looking at around 5 or 6 marks on this question for you explaining the ideas and the concepts. Okay, so a reminder then, explanation, what does the writer mean? Exploration, what language or structural techniques mean for the different readers? And then analysis, other or different interpretations, connotations, and imagery. You might find it easier to analyze the language than you might do the structure. So, if you're only just going to be dipping in and doing a bit of analysis to try and get yourself into that top band, then perhaps the language techniques are easier to analyze, talking about why the writer's chosen that particular word or phrase, rather than, attempting to do that with the structure can be quite a challenge. Not impossible, though. All right, so some things you could have talked about. All the ones here in green are referring to language, and all the ones in blue are referring to structure. They're not written in terms of sentences. These are just sort of advice from the mark scheme. That's why I haven't put capital letters there just at the beginning, just to let you know these aren't intended to be sentences. Okay, so the writer uses a simile like pirouetting on the ledge to suggest great peril on the mountain. You've got your emotive verbs such as huddled and suffered to help build a feeling that the group are vulnerable and at mercy of the mountain. Emotive language and alliteration of the phrase on the verge of complete collapse to emphasize how close to disaster the groups are. The writers use short sentences to suggest sudden dramatic moments of realization. I had reached the top, so that's your final sentence, your single sentence paragraph. You got the first paragraph, which uses a long, complex sentence to detail the height of the mountain, helping to echo the vast size and challenge of the climb the group is about to begin. You've got the repetition of the word steep to emphasize the clear focus the writer has on the dangerous slopes. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on my suggestion of first person narrative voice, talking about the feelings and the emotions and the sensory elements, you can pick out some quotes definitely to go with that there. And if you wanted to be doing a little bit of analysis, something like the word pirouetting is quite nice to play around with here. You know, why pirouetting? Obviously, pirouette is a dance term. So why have you used a dance term to talk about, you know, dancing on the ledge of a mountain? You know, perhaps that idea of, you know, enjoyment or fun, but also perhaps that precarious concept about when, you know, try and pirouette, you got to try and go on your toes when you're balleting. Isn't very easy for most people to do. It takes years of practice. And of course, these people have not practiced climbing. They've never done it before. So it kind of emphasizes how ridiculous it is that they're in this situation, just the same as if, you know, expected me, an English lecturer, to start pirouetting around the classroom. Okay, on question 5 then, we have our first language, our first comparison question. And again, this part here is the only part that's going to be different when you sit your exam, but that both text 1 and 2 in this case describe people in dangerous situations. Obviously the focus is going to be different depending on what text you've got. The rest of it, or this bit here, is going to be exactly the same on the 5th of June 2026, or whenever else you might be sitting this paper, depending on when you're watching the video. The experiences are different, but they share similarities. Write a summary giving 3 separate ways these experiences are similar and support each similarity with evidence from both texts. Now, what I've done here is I've put a line through the word different, and I always do that for my students, because if I don't do that, they're going to start talking about, well, they're similar, but they're also different. And I don't want you to do that on this question. We only want 3 separate ways that the experiences are similar. You get nothing for talking about differences. If you want to do that, save that for question 6, because you can definitely do that in question 6. But in question 5, we just want 3 separate similarities. So hopefully, as you were reading text 2 for the first time, you did start to notice the similarities between the 2 texts. And I would suggest you highlight or underline where you see that. You are going to need quotes, so that is going to be useful for you to do. And again, what I've suggested you do here is I've put this little timer here for you, so you might want to pause the video at this point and have a look through the entire text, both of the 2 texts, and give yourself 10 minutes to do so, and then write the answer, because in a moment I am going to go through the answers for you. So you can pause the video now if you wish. Okay, so what you needed to do here was 3 separate comparative points, and you do need a quote from each text per point to hit the maximum mark. So in total, you're going to have 6 quotes on this question. If you drop a quote or you don't have 3 comparative paragraphs, you will be penalised in terms of your marks. So this is the mark scheme, and this is how it works. Notice here that if you have less than 3 similarities, you are not going to get more than 2 marks on this question. So please make sure that you focus on making sure you've got 3 similarities. If you've done that, then straight away you can jump into this box where you might have 3 similarities which are mostly distinct. So what that means is you might have had 2 similarities that are a bit similar to each other. So you might have said, for example, that both feature climbing and both feature people climbing mountains, which are too similar, I would say. So try and make sure that your 3 similarities are distinct similarities. You need to have a clear synthesis of evidence from both the text, so you need to be pulling some quotes from it, and a valid selection of textual evidence, but not fully developed. Means you might drop a quote somewhere, you might have forgotten a quote, or your quote might not prove your point, which means you're not necessarily going to get out of this box. But actually, I would say this is one of the easiest questions to get maximum marks on. And all you have to do to achieve this is make sure you've got 3 fully distinct selections of similarities, a precise synthesis, so in other words, 3 really clear statements about the similarities, and appropriate and relevant textual selection to support. So a quote from each text per comparative point. This question does not test language analysis, so you really don't get anything for saying the writer uses a simile here, or the writer's use of the simile could mean this and it could also mean that. Don't be tempted to do that because you're not going to get any marks for it. The most here you'll need is a bit of an explanation about how your quote proves your point. So this implies, this suggests. You definitely can do that to get the higher marks, but you don't need to analyze language. So to get from level 1 to level 2, you need to include 3 separate comparisons with quotes, which is all you really need to be getting an equivalent of about grade 4, but you definitely could get 6 marks on this question if you adhere to the advice. And again, what I've done here is I've pulled out some extracts from the mark scheme. They are not sentences, and I've indicated that by not starting them with capital letters. But here are some of the things that you could have compared. So both texts describe dangerous situations on mountains. Text 1, the writer mentions the mountain, and text 2, the writer also mentions the mountain several times. To develop that further, really, you could talk about what implies it's dangerous, and maybe pull out some quotes about how dangerous they are. Height, for example, is another one. And the 2 texts both show the dangers associated with height. So text 1 states the mountain rises 3,000 feet. The other one, the writer tells us the mountain rises to nearly 17,000 feet. You could add to that and obviously say that, the height is, of course, implying that it's dangerous if you wanted to. The 2 texts both describe the environment that sounds difficult or challenging. I mean, to be honest, that's a given because we know that from one of the questions we already had earlier. Jagged crater is our example from text 1, and slopes that were too steep is our example in text 2. So obviously you might want to add a bit of an explanation there about how that might imply it's difficult, but we don't need to analyze anything. And then the final suggestion is that it shows 2 people questioning if they'll make it. So you've got how far is there to go, and do you still think we can make it by nightfall? Another one, of course, here is that they both use dialogue because that's present as well. There are lots and lots of things, and there always will be that you need to compare, or you could compare, and you only need 3. I've given you an example of 4 here, but you only need 3. I would suggest that you use words like both to make it really clear that you're showing the similarities. So as an examiner, I definitely would be skimming through, looking for the word both 3 times. I would also suggest that you separate your 3 comparisons into 3 separate paragraphs, which really makes it clear to the examiner that you've got 3. Don't make them work hard to try and find your 3 similarities, because then it's harder for them to be able to award those marks to you. You want to make it clear for them, make it easy for them to award you marks. An example is here. The texts both show that the dangers associated with height. Text 1, the writer states the mountain rises 3,000 feet above them. Text 2, the writer tells us the mountain rises nearly 17,000 feet. Both of these are very high, and this emphasizes the danger the climbers who were not experienced. 3 of those paragraphs, 3 like that, with those components highlighted for you, the word both, and the quotes from text 1 and text 2, and a bit of an explanation, would be enough to get you 6 marks. And that's all you need to do to quite easily get 6 marks on the bag on this question. Okay, my final question for you to look at on section A is question 6. And again, I've popped a 20-minute paragraph timer in here for you, which you might want to, after I've gone through and explained, use to have a little practice at this question. And this question has a lot of similarities between this one and the one you're going to get in the real thing, because the only thing that's going to change when you sit on the 5th of June or whenever else you sit it is the bit that's in bold, being on a journey. Compare the writer's ideas and perspectives about being on a journey. So that's going to be your focus for this question. The rest of it is going to be exactly the same. You should focus them, you should compare the writer's main ideas, points of view, and presentation of these ideas and views. Use examples from both texts to support your comparison. And you get 16 marks for this question, which is why I'm suggesting you spend about 20 minutes on this. Now, disappointingly as an examiner, if anyone is going to miss a question, this tends to be the one. So quite often when I'm looking at the questions to mark, students don't attempt the answer. And really, all you need to do is get a few ideas down to even get a couple of marks. Even if you talked about the 3 similarities that you talked about in question 5, you're still going to get something because you're making some comparisons. And if you've got the quotes there as well, that will really help you. Now, you're only going to get a few marks by doing that, but isn't that better than getting no marks at all? So if you are running out of time, you've got your timing a little bit off, or if you draw a blank a little bit on this one, definitely by commenting on some of the things you talked about in question 5, that is going to get you some marks. So that is one little suggestion I have for you. However, we want more than just a few marks. So what else can we do? This essentially is a comparison question. So really what you need to be doing is thinking about how the texts are both similar and different. You can talk about similarities, you can talk about differences, you can talk about both. And really you can compare anything you like in terms of language, in terms of structure, in terms of ideas, attitudes, points of view, because really you're going to be covering a lot of these concepts on these bullet points through doing that. So let's explore how we do that. Okay, just take you back. Sorry, I've started the timer and I don't want to do that. So what we're doing here then is we're having a little look at things that we need to make sure we include on this question. So firstly, you must give detail of both texts to get above 6 marks. Sometimes students who don't get very many marks for this question talk all about what is happening in the first text and who's telling the story and what their attitude is. And they might even give me a lovely little bit of language analysis or structural analysis. But then they do that again for the second text and they're not drawing comparisons all the way through. So in order to help you to make sure you don't do that, plan on using comparative language. So plan on using words like both do this or one does this, whereas the other does that. If you plan on that comparative language, it will stop you from avoiding comparison, which actually will stop you from getting above 6 marks. So as an examiner, I would be skimming through, looking for that comparative language in order to be able to access the higher mark boundaries. Try and give a separate paragraph per comparative point. Again, that stops you from muddying the water on what you're comparing. So starting off with something like, both of the texts show that the journey that they are on is difficult. Then you've got the quote from text 1, a bit of an explanation, quote from the text 2 with a bit of an explanation, some analysis of the techniques maybe that are used as well would really help you. And then do that again in 2 more paragraphs. Give quotes from each text as evidence. So every time you make a comment or comparative point about both of the texts, pull a quote out from both texts to add that sort of justification of that evidence. For stronger marks, also try and look at language and structural techniques. So it's a bit of a pulling together of all the different skills that you've been doing and all the questions up to this point. What you're doing here is you're pulling out similarities or differences, but you're also analysing the language or the structure that the writer has used as well to hit those top marks. And in order to be able to try and do that, one of the things that you could definitely do is compare narrative voice. If you look at the narrative voice of both of the texts, talk about how they're similar or different and how it works, this will help you to hit the last 2 bullet points. First of all, it helps you to explore the point of view because you're knowing whether the story is told through the point of view of the person who's experiencing this situation, so whether those thoughts and feelings are their own, or whether this is completely fictitious and told through the eyes of maybe an omniscient narrator, and how that's actually allowing us to access these ideas and perspectives. But also, it shows you the presentation of these ideas and views because you're talking about the use of a particular technique. And this time, we're talking about a structural technique in terms of the narrative voice. So that's one of my easy wins that I always suggest to my students that they do. So you're looking for, again, for doing maybe three or 4 at the most paragraphs. And one of those could definitely be narrative voice to help you to hit those techniques. So things that you could have compared. Examples, how the journeys are described. So you could definitely look at that. Maybe you could look at how the writers both use a simile, or one uses a simile, or one uses a metaphor to describe the journey, or you can definitely include your narrative voice comments in that as well. We could just talk about, how the journeys are both quite difficult journeys and your quotes to prove that. How the challenges of the journey are faced by people involved, so what they do to overcome the journey and the challenges, how the thoughts and feelings of the people involved are shown, maybe through the use of dialogue, for example. That's a similarity we explored or talked about in question 5. Remember, you can reuse that information. How the experiences described by each writer are different. So you could definitely explore, how each of the different sort of narrators talk about what's happening to those people, or the overall feelings about the journey, the attitudes towards the journey. You know, that feeling of overcoming the journey, the feeling of it being a little bit too much, the feeling of giving up, maybe bringing in some sensory language here, because that's definitely used to talk about the feelings of the journeys. So they're just a few things that you could compare on. Remember, there are lots of things that you can compare on here, similarities and or differences, techniques that are used, absolutely up to you, as long as it's about the journeys, which of course the two texts focus on anyway. So in terms of the mark scheme on this question, it looks a little bit like this. So I'm going to look at the middle band here, because this is the minimum that you want to be looking for to get a grade 4. The response considers a range of comparisons. This is why I suggest that you do 3 or 4, 3 paragraphs at the most, 3 or 4 paragraphs at the most to compare. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, this word range to me is quite an interesting one. If you do 1 comparison, that's just 1. If you do 2 comparisons, that's a couple. If you do 3, I would consider that we're now getting into this idea of a range of comparisons between the texts. In addition to that, you want to be explaining why the writer has used that particular language or structural technique, if you can. So maybe you talk about how the writer has talked about both of the journeys as being really challenging, and in your quotes you've got words or phrases that imply that it's challenging, and you've explained those words or phrases and how they imply it's challenging. And your selection of references across both texts is appropriate. So you've got quotes from both texts per comparative point to make it really clear. Moving into the next level, you want a wide range of comparisons. So here, you don't have to write more paragraphs to hit this. It's more about making sure that the comparisons you've made are really quite different from each other. So one might explore, for example, the idea of how the journey is difficult because of the height of the mountain, and the other one might explore the feelings of the people who are on the journey. They're quite different ideas. They're not similar to each other. So definitely we're falling into the concept of wide range if we do 3 really different concepts or ideas. And here we're exploring how the writer has used their ideas. This is where we're going to start talking about why the writer has used that particular word or phrase, so language, or maybe why the writers use that particular structural technique. And that could include, of course, narrative voice, but it also could include that particular structure of that paragraph, or structure of that sentence, or use of punctuation. Again, we've got that balanced reference to really back up our points. To get maximum marks on this question, it really is achievable, and I want to highlight like that to a lot of students who look at this and think this is a lot to do. Yes, it is, I'm not going to lie, but actually you can definitely do this. And the difference here in terms of this is you're now going to analyze. So as you've picked out quotes with words or phrases that are particularly interesting, talk about why the writer has used that word or phrase. Let's go back to this idea about snake-like. We definitely could here go back to using some of the analysis we did on previous questions. You definitely can double up. You don't need to analyze something different to what you did on a previous question. If you were really confident talking about why the writer has used the word snake on snake-like, and it's talking about how it's made the journey difficult and how that's made the writer, the narrator really fearful because it's a snake-like mountain, then definitely here we can start to analyze the use of the word snake. In terms of some of the other components, we want to make discriminating points. That means that we're really going to be looking at, the quotes being particularly on point. So, just carefully choosing the quotes that you've got to back that point up. But again, we definitely can get into this box. So sitting around here for a grade 4 equivalent, but this is definitely achievable if we just know exactly what it is the examiner is looking for us to be able to do. So obviously you can go off and watch some more videos about analysing language or analysing structure here to help you with that analysis skill. And definitely watch my video about how to compare. I've done a separate video about comparison questions on paper 2 to just kind of, re-emphasise those points. But just being clear on those skills is really going to help you to achieve well on this question, where, as I mentioned earlier on, unfortunately, lots of students don't even attempt. Okay, so possible answers. You might talk about, for example, how both texts describe people facing journeys up mountains. So in text 1, the writer details Sam and Frodo as they are stumbling forward, whilst in text 2, the writer describes a climb that would test a team of expert climbers. So here we've got that comparative point. We've got the highlighting of the word both to show that I'm comparing. We've got a quote from text 1 and a quote from text 2, which is what you need to be getting into that middle band. But for further marks to access the higher band, we might want to start analysing a bit. So stumbling tells us his muscles are failing, his reflexes are gone, and he no longer has the motor control to walk with a steady upright gait. He is essentially falling upward. Stumbling implies loss of control, a lack of grace, and an impending fall. It is a word associated with weakness. So here we can emphasise how difficult the journey is for one of our characters here, or two of our characters here, just by zooming in and emphasizing the idea of the word stumbling and why the word stumbling has been used. Of course, we want to talk that as being a verb as well, to really hit those higher marks. Other things we could do, and things we could talk about, both texts describe journeys in environments that seem dangerous or threatening. So the path is paved with broken rubble and beaten ash, and the slopes are too steep as the mountain falls away. Or we could talk about in text 1, the writer describes a journey which has a focus on the physical exertion, like a snail. And in text 2, there is a greater focus on the climate and challenge created by the weather, so we kept ourselves from freezing. So again, that's a difference that we could focus on. And there are lots and lots of similarities and differences that you could have picked out. I've done a little kind of a comparison here for narrative voice as well, just to emphasize my suggestion that I made earlier. So text 1 uses third-person narration to explore the relationship between Frodo and Sam, when his will laid Frodo gently down. This shows how Frodo relies on Sam to carry him through this difficult climb, especially when he thanks him through the dialogue exchange that follows. However, text 2 uses first-person narration to explore the physical challenges of the climb on the narrator. We kept ourselves from freezing. This mention of the physical challenges, sensory, here are more prominent in this text as we explore the harsh environment rather than show the interaction and relationship of the characters. Okay, so this ticks the box of the structural, because I'm talking about third-person narrative, for example. It also ticks the box of the difference. And I've also got some language techniques in here. I've talked about sensory language, and I've talked about something else here. Oh, dialogue as well, structural comment. So we've got a few things here that this ticks the boxes of, but this is just an example of how I might compare narrative voice as one of my paragraphs. Okay, we're now going to move on to talking very briefly about questions 7 or 8. So questions 7 and 8, you have got a choice of 2 different questions. The first one is definitely an imaginative piece with the line, "I'm so glad they were with me." Notice these questions here are very, very vague and very, very loose. So it's quite possible that you have already got a genre in mind. For example, you might really love writing horror stories or thriller stories, or you might already have a bit of an idea about what you want to write. And definitely the looseness of these questions would allow you to tweak and apply a bit of an outline for an idea for you here. In addition to that, you have also got an option to write about a time when you or someone you know. That bit's always going to be the same. And in this particular paper, went on a journey. So again, really, really loose. You can write about real or imagined events. I just want to emphasize for you here, if you're going to do something a bit autobiographical, please don't make it like a report. Unfortunately, a lot of the time when I read responses to this question, we have things like I got out of bed, caught the bus to college, and it's very reported, it's very recounty. What we want here is to make sure that even if you're not going down the route of an imagined piece of writing, you still use the techniques that you would use in an imaginative piece of writing to tell a real story. You know, look at any autobiography or memoir piece of non-fiction writing. They're still writing to engage and entertain. So looking, for example, at the Alive text that we looked at, text 2, there are lots of sensory and figurative techniques that are still being employed to make this piece of writing interesting to read. If it's not interesting to read and you don't transport us to your world, we are not going to enjoy reading it. We don't want to read a recount. We want to read something that is interesting to read. So please bear that in mind. Okay, now on this question, firstly, question 7, we do not need, or we won't be penalised if we decide to use "I'm so glad that we were with me" at the end rather than the beginning. Although one of my pieces of advice is to use a really interesting structural feature, such as a circular structural feature. So there is nothing to stop you using it at both the beginning and the end, for example, that you start and end in the same place. I'll come back to talking about structure in a moment. On this one here, you may wish to base your responses on images. So to be in line perhaps with other exam boards, there are a choice of 2 images here that you may use if you wish to be a bit of a springboard for your writing. And you could also, of course, use them to help you with question 7. You do not need to do that if you don't want to. But for those of you, again, who've come from a different exam board and usually use an image as a bit of a stimulus for a bit of creative writing with a backstory as a bit of a springboard from an image, then absolutely you can do that. And these questions are tested on assessment objective 5 and 6. That's exactly the same as any exam board that you would look at. It's also exactly the same assessment objectives as you was tested on paper 1. So what we're testing on here is our ability to communicate clearly, effectively, and imaginatively. And I would definitely highlight the word imaginatively here, because that's the difference perhaps that's more emphasized between this and the previous paper. You are going to select and adapt your tone, your start, and your register. In this case, not for a different form in terms of things like letters and emails that you might have had to do on paper 1, but more in terms of your genre decisions. So, for example, you might write something like a thriller or a horror, and you want to be thinking about how you're going to do that. And you're also going to want to think about your narrative voice as well. So you're going to write in first person, in which case you want that real sensory language and those real references to, that figurative sort of concept, where you're going to be thinking about how we think and we feel as that narrator. What did you feel? What did you see? What did you smell? What did you taste? But also, what tense are you going to write in? You're going to write in past tense. You're going to write in present tense. Are you going to use the generic conventions of a horror? Are you going to use the generic conventions of a romance? How do you want your reader to feel, and how are you going to achieve that? In terms of your purposes and audience, I would hasten to say that this is more relevant perhaps to the paper 1, where you have to write, for example, to persuade or advise or inform. An audience might include things that, your peer group, or a more formal audience. I'm going to say that this is not something you need to worry about too much if you really concentrate on form here. So for form, you just want to be thinking about all those things that I've just gone through in terms of narrative voice and tense, etc. In terms of organizing your information and ideas, I think using structural features and grammatical features, I'm going to mention in a moment about how to plan and definitely achieve marks on that section. What you don't want to be doing or thinking about doing here is the structural and grammatical features of something like a letter or an article. That's not relevant to this. You are going to be writing a bit of free creative writing. In terms of assessment objective 6, it is very loosely based on your SPAG. So your vocabulary, your sentence structure, your clarity. So when I read it, does it make sense? Are you going to be making me think and feel a certain way? So in terms of purpose, are you making me feel tense or excited? Or, how are you wanting your reader to feel? And you want accurate spelling and punctuation. And I would say that as long as you've made sure that you're clear on things like your homophones, as long as it's only the challenging vocabulary that you're struggling to spell, you are still very capable of passing and getting a grade 4 on this paper, as long as everything else is in place. I would say, though, that punctuation is relatively non-negotiable. To get a grade 4, you need to be knowing how to use your full stops and your capital letters and avoiding your comma splices. Okay, just a reminder then of some of the images you might get. Some of them are a little bit bizarre and vague. Some of them are more perhaps accessible. I would say this one is, again, a bit like Marmite. I like to talk about Marmite. Some people would love it, some people would hate it. What can you do with it? Well, you could definitely talk about, what you would think, feel, use your senses here if you were going to be present in this situation. Maybe add some figurative techniques. What does that person feel like? What do the mountains look like? Think about backstory maybe. How does that person get here? So maybe a springboard of description and then a bit of a backstory about what they're doing there and why they're there. Talking about what you can see and, using that as a bit of a springboard for a piece of creative writing. Just a bit of a reminder here, for taking you back maybe to your primary days. Don't forget things that you learned in primary, because actually that was getting you ready for this moment. Think about your ambitious vocabulary. Make sure that you're using the most interesting version of the words you can. I always try and give a bit of a guidance that for a grade 4, you want to be using at least three really lovely sort of ambitious words that you can definitely pre-think about using. Maybe that no matter what question you're going to do, you're going to describe the weather in the beginning, in which case choose 3 really lovely words that describe the weather. Thunderous, for example, is an example that's here. Formidable is another one. Atmospheric. So try and use some interesting words if you can. In addition to that, try and use some interesting connectives, so connect your ideas together, and try and vary your sentence length and your word order to keep your reader interested. Your simple sentences for that dramatic impact, maybe even some single sentence paragraphs or even fragments, and your more complex sentences to try and achieve something that's a bit more sort of descriptive. In terms of your punctuation, you want to be making sure that you use a variety of punctuation here. So to get a grade 4, you want to be sitting somewhere perhaps in this this band here, where you know how to use your full stops, your question marks, your commas, your exclamation marks, your speech marks, your ellipsis. And then if you want to be getting higher marks, you still want to be including things like colons, semicolons, brackets and dashes. And you'll see in a moment when I advise on how to plan, how I would make sure that I include at least 3 fancy pieces of punctuation in my plan to try and make sure that I'm hitting those higher marks for that. And then finally, you want to be thinking carefully about your sentence openers. You don't want to be using just the and I and my to begin each sentence or each paragraph. You want to be varying those for effect. So again, have a little look at options for that. Maybe starting with adverbials, fronted adverbials is a nice way of doing that. Okay, so just a reminder then that you want to make sure that you use your sensory language. You also might want to make sure that you build in some lovely figurative language. So again, you can pre-plan those if you know, for example, that you're going to write about the weather in the beginning of your piece of creative writing. Maybe think of a really lovely simile that you're definitely going to be able to use. I would recommend that you try and build in at least 3 nice pieces of figurative language, not cliched ones like my feet were as cold as ice, but something a bit more interesting than that, in order to hit a grade 4. And obviously you can do more than that if you wish. I wouldn't completely fill it with it. It tends to lose its impact if you use loads and loads and loads. Okay, and then I just want to talk to you briefly about how I would make sure I plan. So firstly, I would definitely make a quick plan. I'd organise my ideas into clear paragraphs and use a list of devices that I would include. I would spend 5 to 10 minutes doing that. Remember to use appropriate language. The examiner will look for a range of language techniques. Use a wide vocabulary and varied punctuation and sentence structure, as I mentioned earlier on, and definitely plan to use 5 minutes of proofreading at the end to pick up some of those, what I call silly errors or common errors, that use of comma splicing where you don't need to do it, for example. Check for clear meaning, a range of punctuation and accurate spelling, punctuation and grammar. Make sure it makes sense. Think about your grammar. Consider appropriate structure for effect, and I would aim for 600 words. That's about 2 to 3 sides of most people's handwriting. So most people, because if obviously you've got crazy size handwriting, then you need to do a little bit more. There is nothing in the rubric that tells you have to write 600 words, but my experience as an examiner shows me that if you're writing too much less than that, maybe 300 or 400 words, sometimes it's quite hard to see that you've actually achieved what you've set out to do. And if you write too much more, it tends to be a little bit waffly and loses direction. So if you aim to write about that amount, which you should be able to do after a bit of practice anyway, in that amount of time, then you should be more or less where you need to be. So what I would definitely make sure I do is use this planning box. This planning box is going to prevent you from losing track, and it's going to give you some real quality to your writing. It is by no mistake that students who don't use this planning box don't tend to achieve as well on the things that I'm going to talk about. So firstly, I would make a bit of a rough 5-point paragraph. Now, definitely you can use the story mountain here, your beginning, your middle and your end, and you could potentially still achieve a grade 4 by doing that. You need to make sure that you've got your climax, your conflict within that story. But actually to achieve higher marks and impress that examiner, think a bit more about how you're going to structure your story. For example, you might want to start off with a hook where you use on media res in the beginning. So start in the middle of the action, maybe with some dialogue or some kind of mystery, but something that really grabs your attention. Examiners are reading an awful lot of text, so they want to make sure that you grab their attention, that you stand out from the rest when they pick up that text that's written by you. Maybe in your second paragraph, you can zoom in on something such as the feelings of the character or a particular setting. And in your third paragraph, maybe you need to flash back to how it all began. Now, earlier that day kind of concept, where you're also using that nice connecting phrase. Then you might want to go back to your main event. So meanwhile, And then perhaps at the end, you might want to circle back to the start. So a 5-part paragraph plan doesn't necessarily mean 5 paragraphs. You can, of course, have some single sentence paragraphs in there for a particular effect. It's more like a 5-part plan than a 5-paragraph plan. I would definitely make sure that I remember to use the senses, and I would plan to use 3 different pieces at least of figurative language, maybe onomatopoeia, simile, and personification. And I would also make sure that I've noted my 3 different pieces of punctuation that I want to use that's going to achieve those higher levels. So maybe some speech marks if I've planned to use some dialogue, maybe a semicolon where I was tempted to use a comma splice earlier on, maybe an exclamation mark, and maybe some brackets. So these are going to help you make sure that you hit those higher marks. Okay, so all I'm really left to say to you now is good luck, and please do look at some of my other videos. As I said, there are videos about comparisons, for example, that are on this paper, and there are other videos for you to watch. Please do like my channel and subscribe to my channel, can't say that, which will allow you to have access to each video each time I update. And thank you very much for listening. Best of luck.